Hello, friends. Today's podcast question says, "Thank you for your wonderful podcast. I'm a fan. One thing you were teaching in a recent episode bothers me. You said that we need to punish our kids because sin always leads to punishment. Is this actually how God disciplines us? Why aren't natural consequences enough?" This is a really good question. And to the person who wrote this in, thank you so much for writing it in, especially when there was something in the podcast that you weren't sure of was biblical, because I always appreciate that because it gives me an opportunity to take a step back and say, okay, let me look at what was said in this podcast. Was this actually biblical? Because it's a really important thing to think through. That I do a lot of prep for these podcasts and I pray a lot before them, but I am still a fallible human. So we're going to look at what was said in that podcast and is it actually biblical? So that's the question we're going to dive down deep into today on the Foundation Worldview podcast, where we seek to answer your questions so that you can equip the children that God has placed in your care to carefully evaluate every idea they encounter and understand the truth of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I'm thrilled that you've joined me for another episode today. Now, in preparation for this podcast, I wanted to make sure that I understood the questioner's question. So I went back and I reviewed the podcast that this person was referring to. And it was a podcast called How to Address Deception in Kids. And so the statement that the questioner is talking about, what I said, the exact quote is, "We do our children a disservice when they don't understand that they are being punished for something, because sin always leads to punishment." So that is what I said in that podcast. And I was saying it within the context of addressing deception when our kids lie to us. And I was saying how the world kind of shies away from the word punishment, but that our kids, they need to know that they are being punished. And so what I was trying to communicate in that phrase that I don't know that I communicated clearly is that when we are discipling our children, okay, an important part of discipling is discipline when they sin. And what we're doing in this discipline is we are teaching them this pattern that sin leads to punishment. So we want them to understand this repeated pattern. Sin leads to punishment. So that's what I was trying to communicate, that we want our children to understand sin leads to punishment. Now the questioner asks, is this how God disciplines us? Does he always punish us when we sin? That's an important question to think through. Now, it is true that sin always leads to punishment. Romans chapter 6, verse 23 says, "For the wages of sin is death." That's the wages of sin, that sin leads to death. And so I think sometimes in the Christian community, we tend to think that grace is just like winking at sin, that it's as if God is winking at us and saying, you know what? It's not that big a deal. I'm going to let you off the hook this time. Where that's not what grace is. That grace, God's grace, is Jesus bearing the full weight of God's wrath toward our sin on the cross. This is made clear in Isaiah 53, which is a prophecy about Jesus, specifically in verses 4-6. And this passage says, "Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace. And with his wounds, we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way. And the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." So all sin leads to punishment. And that punishment is either borne by us through eternal separation from God, or it is borne by Jesus. That when we receive God's grace through his forgiveness, it means that Jesus has already been punished for every single sin that we have committed. That sin always leads to punishment. Now, as God's children, we are not punished through eternal separation from God. But when we sin, God does discipline us out of love. That in the book of Hebrews, it says that, if we are not disciplined, we are illegitimate children, that we are not actually children of God, because all of God's children he disciplines because he loves them. Now, the next part of this question says, why aren't natural consequences enough? So when we think about our children, when they sin and we implement a punishment, why isn't it enough just to have natural consequences? Well, natural consequences are important and they are unavoidable. If if your child disobeys and they put their hand on the hot stove, they're going to get burned. It's not like you purposely wanted them to get burned. You were trying to keep them safe from having them not get burned, but that natural consequence is there. Now, why aren't natural consequences enough? Well, they're not enough when our children are still living within our homes, because these are the training years. These are the years when we are establishing the patterns of behavior in their lives that they are going to follow for the rest of their lives. And so what we're establishing in the home is things that are going to follow them for the rest of their lives. I mean, a somewhat silly example is appetites. What kind of appetites are we cultivating in our children? Now, as I was in my 20s and I lived with a host of different roommates, I noticed that so many of my roommates struggled to control their appetites, that they really struggled with food. And now I know this is something that many people struggle with. And I'm not saying that this struggle with food was all their parents' faults, but as we would have conversations, they would just share with me how their parents would just kind of let them eat whatever they wanted when they were growing up. Where for me, food has never really been a struggle for me. I enjoy food. There's many foods I really like, but because of the good habits that my parents instilled in us when growing up, I don't really have a problem setting limits on what I eat or the types of things that I eat because of what they trained me in when I was growing up. Now, I don't do everything identical to my parents. There's some things that they enforced that I've decided when I was an adult, like, nah, I don't really think that's that important for me. But they set those basic ground rules that have really set me on a trajectory of success for my dietary needs for the rest of my life. And so similar, when our children are in our homes, it's our job to train them well. Now, the secular world believes that children internally know what is best for them better than anyone else. And now we do want to love our children through taking their emotions into account. We do want to do that. However, the Bible does not teach this secular view that children internally know what is best for them better than anyone else. And this is made clear specifically in Proverbs, but in other places in the Bible. I'm going to read for us several verses from Proverbs and then one from Ephesians that just show that the secular view is not accurate. Proverbs 19 verse 18 says, "Discipline your son, for there is hope. Do not set your heart on putting him to death." And so it said right here that if we don't discipline our children, we are setting them up for death, not for life. Proverbs 22 verse 15 says, "Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him." Now, I know that might make some of us cringe and think, oh my goodness, it's talking about the rod. The rod was a tool of correction. It was not a tool of abuse. Now, can the rod be used in an abusive way? Absolutely. And in scripture, we're going to get to these verses that talk specifically against that. But when a shepherd had a rod, they would not use it to abuse their sheep. They would use it to correct them so that they would stay within the fold. Proverbs 23 verses 13 and 14 says, "Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol." And as I said in the verse above, that this rod of discipline, that it can be done in a loving way. I recently saw this in a friend's household that I was staying with a friend and her family for a few weeks. And when I was there, I was working remotely from their house, and I was up in the room that I was staying in, and that room was directly across the hall from my friend's room and her husband's room. And their 18-month-old had deliberately disobeyed her husband. He had done something that her husband had just told him not to do. And so what her husband did is, I was able to hear this because I was just directly across the hall, is he took their son very calmly, he took their son up to his room and he sat him down on the bed and he talked him through, what did daddy tell you to do? That's right. Daddy told you that you are not supposed to do that. And then you did exactly what daddy told you not to do. And he just talked him through and he was like, daddy loves you and daddy wants to teach you to do the right thing. So you're going to get a spanking now. It's not because I'm angry with you, but it's because I love you and I want you to learn how to do what is right. Now, did the son cry when he was getting his spanking? Yes. Did the dad actually hurt him, as in there was something wrong and he was physically hurt after that? No, the spanking didn't feel comfortable, but he didn't hurt him. He did it out of love and he explained that to him. Another verse or another proverb that speaks to this is Proverbs 29 verses 15 and 17. The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Discipline your son and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. So these verses in Proverbs are all talking about how important it is to discipline. That means to enact a consequence, to enact a punishment when children sin. And then another important passage that talks about this is Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. And it says, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So fathers and mothers are not to discipline their children out of anger. They're not specifically supposed to anger their children. Now, things we do may anger our children because our children are sinful just like we are, but we are not to actually provoke our children to anger. That is sinning. We are to bring our children up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. Now, there is a limited window in which we have to train our children, both to behave in ways that honor God and also to love things that honor God. It's a very limited window. Those of you who have teenagers, you know that you still have authority over your teenager, but the authority that you have over your teenager is not as great as the authority you had over your 8-year-old, which is not as great as the authority you had over your toddler. So it's a very limited window in which God has given us the privilege of training our children to behave in ways that honor God and also to love things that honor God. And so this is why natural consequences are not enough, that our children have to know that they are being disciplined because sin always leads to punishment. And we are trying to train them to love God and to love others. Now, if you're watching this video on YouTube and you have specific examples of how you have disciplined your children out of love, if you think those examples would be helpful, please feel free to write those in the comments. Would love to hear different ways that Christian parents are intentionally seeking to bring their children up in the fear and instruction of the Lord through loving discipline. Now, if you're thinking, Elizabeth, I have never seen what you are talking about. I have no idea how to do this well. I think a great example of this is given in the children's picture book, Arlo and the Great Big Cover-Up by Betsy Childs Howard. In this book, it's a book that a little boy disobeys his mom in something big and he tries to hide his sin and he can't do it. And the mom talks him through how we can never hide our sin from God. And so she disciplines him in that book in a very loving and gentle and restorative way. So if you're thinking, I don't know what loving discipline looks like, Elizabeth, I highly recommend you check out the book Arlo and the Great Big Cover-Up. Also recommend that you check out our parenting seminar that we recently recorded at Foundation Worldview. In that seminar, we go through what does holistic discipleship look like? And we talk about discipline and we talk about the heart of our children and how important it is to develop strong, growing relationships with them. So if you would like more information on that, please check out our parenting seminar. I think you will really be encouraged by that. Well, that's a wrap for this episode. But if you have been encouraged by this content or if it's benefited you in some way, please invest the few seconds that it takes to rate, review, like, and subscribe. As we leave our time together, my prayer for you is that no matter the situation in which you and the children God has placed in your care find yourselves, that you would trust that God is working all things together for your good by using all things to conform you more into the image of His Son. I'll see you next time.